Today on Mad Goblin Kitbashes, we're gonna travel to the past, find ourselves a T-Rex, and blast him into a scrappy sci-fi future. Basically, think of Mad Max had dinosaurs. This is going to be a really large kitbash, so we're gonna split it into two parts. In this episode, we're gonna cover the entire build process, then we're gonna follow up with the final assembly and paint in the next episode. So let's not waste any time, let's get started. To start things off, we're going to use this Tyrannosaurus Rex figure from Montoy. Now, I can't make any claims to its accuracy, but I was pretty happy with the overall size and detail level of it, so it should be a great start to get things going. The problem with these figures is that they tend to have a lot of mold lines on them, so it requires a lot of going through and cleaning up the lines. Typically with these figures, you can just hit them with a heat gun, and by doing that, it's pretty malleable and you can form them to the shapes that you want. However, this one was proving to be a little fickle, so I attempted at least to put some slices into the areas that I wanted to collapse in, and then applying some super glue and then trying to kind of hold it in place. Again, with the mold lines, this one unfortunately had a really nasty mold line right down the center of it, which was kind of frustrating. It seemed like it was like a two-part mold and then they just plopped it right together in the middle. But it's going to take a little bit of work to clean that up. First thing we're building here is a giant metal jaw that's going to be bolted onto the side of the T-Rex's mouth. So this is going to be made of styrene sheet, and we're getting some paneling that's going to be added on to the sides afterward. That way it looks like it's made of scrap metal panels that are just welded and bolted and riveted onto the side of the T-Rex's head. It's going to give it that really cool, menacing, scrappy look to it. Here I'm using green stuff, which is just a two-part epoxy that you just mix up and then you can sculpt it into areas. I wanted to fill in the bottom of that jaw. Initially, I was just going to have it to look like thick metal, but later on you'll see I end up changing that. The one thing that's going to make this jaw really stand out is going to have some bolted-on metal teeth. They're just shards of ripped metal that are just riveted onto the side of the jaw. This is really what's going to make it stand out and make it look like he eats vehicles for breakfast. The hinge of the jaw kind of needed something that brought it together, that kind of made it seem like it was feasible. And the one thing I ended up using were motherboard hex mounts, and they ended up working really great. They sort of look like Frankenstein bolts just sticking on the hinge of the jaw, and made it seem like it was a working pivot point. I think the important thing for this model that's going to really bring it all together is the little details. And what's going to be really important is these little bolts that I'm making. So I end up using just thin strips of styrene, chopping them up, and making little bolts out of those. I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to add LEDs to this whole kit. And the first thing I thought of when conceiving this project was a glowing red cyborg eye. So what I end up doing is I have what I believe is a Space Marine Dreadnought searchlight. I end up carving that out, and then I have an LED that I had wrapped styrene around, and that way I form a shell around it that I then insert into the searchlight. From there I'll have wire attachments going in, and then I'll clear out the actual eye area just because it sticks out too much. I'll carve that out with a Dremel, attach that in, and then we'll start wiring it all together. We're coming back to the leg. This leg has been super problematic for me. The heat treatments didn't work, the forming and gluing didn't work, so I'm doing the third method, which is just to chop it off, cut the angles, and then re-glue it. That way it's a surefire way I'll get the exact formation that I want. What I really dislike about this particular figure is the type of material they're using. It's a rubbery plastic. It doesn't play well with knives, it doesn't play well with saws, it doesn't play well with Dremels, it gunks it up. So it's just not fun to work with. I was not happy with how the bottom of the jaw looked, so I'm revisiting that by cutting up a panel that's then going to be glued to the bottom, adding riveted details, and then cleaned up so it looks like it's all part of it. We're going to begin our electronics work with the LED in the eye. So I have a length of wire here that I'm going to solder to the connections on the LED and then throw some shrink tubing on there to kind of seal it up. One of the things I found with this figure is that it's not hollow on the inside, so I can't exactly just run the wires down without doing an immense amount of drilling work to kind of feed it to where I want to go. So I kind of had to plan carefully where I'm going to hide the wires. So I'm running it down the spine because I know I have attachments that are going to go on there. Then I'm running it down what is going to be the boxed in mechanical leg, and then it's going to go into the inside of the leg where it'll be hidden more so it can run down into the base. We're going to begin working on the mechanical leg itself, so I got some styrene already cut up, gluing it on. I'm going to box in the existing leg. Normally if you're building a leg on its own, you can get precise measurements, precise cuts, and it will look really nice. However, with this, we have a lot of folds and bends and curves to deal with that made it really troublesome. But we'll work through it, and nothing a little bit of filler can't fix. I wanted to add that sort of ribbed rubberized material to the joints, typically what you see on sci-fi armor. So what I ended up doing was taking some old IDE ribbon cables I had lying around and chopping them up. They're really simple and flexible to work with, they peel nicely, and for this scale, it actually works perfectly to achieve that effect that I wanted. Again, because we're dealing with an organic shape inside with the leg, there's going to be a lot of cleanup work. It's not going to be the prettiest looking box-in job I've seen, but honestly, we get the panels as close as we can. Any gaps we can fill in with some spot putty, sand it up, and it'll look great in the end, but it's really complex to work in this sort of situation. The main reason why I left the leg in is because I wanted that durability and stability in there, so it's a trade-off, but we end up working around it. I'm just going to lob off this arm here because we don't need it anymore. We need something a little bit more terrifying than a T-Rex arm. So we're going to add a bionic arm, and it's probably going to have some saw blades or something dangerous on the end. For the weapon arm, I end up using some spare mechanical bits I had. Thankfully, I had some varying sizes of them too, so I was able to carve some of them out and can work them together. Always remember, if you're doing any sort of cutting or dremeling with resin materials, there's a lot of fine powder. You don't want to breathe that in, so wear a mask. For the saw arm, we'll call it that for now, is made out of a searchlight holder, I believe, from a 40K tank kit. The arms are made out of styrene rectangular tubing, and the saw blades themselves I had resin printed from a Transformers kit I had found on Thingiverse. One thing this kit needs is big machine guns. Now, in order to get that, I want to put them on the back, so we have to build a harness or a platform that they can connect to.
Now, again, because we're dealing with weird organic shapes, I didn't want to waste styrene when doing this because it's not cheap material. So I ended up making just a paper template. I can go back and forth to kind of find the right shape. Once I have that, I can then transfer it to styrene and cut it out and build it properly with as little waste as possible. This was probably the most frustrating part of this entire build. I wanted to add some spinal plating down the back of the T-Rex. One, because it will look cool, but also its other purpose is to hide the wires that I have running down the spine. None of this would behave properly, it wouldn't cooperate whatsoever. It became super frustrating and took me forever just to get it to hold properly and keep its shape. I eventually trucked through and I got it done. Thank God. It's just so it doesn't look so flat and bare bones. We're gonna add some more panels and more bolting details to the side of this. I wanted a way to show that the platform wasn't just sitting on the back, that there was no like hidden magical bolts on the inside. So what I'm doing is I had some ribbon cable again to the rescue and made some long straps and buckles that connect to the platform itself, to connect to the front. I knew the one thing that this kit needed was ridiculously oversized miniguns on its back. So what I end up doing is finding a knockoff Transformers kit that had the right size of miniguns in terms of scale. So we got those. We're going to chop off the little handles that are on the back. We're going to glue them together properly. We're going to patch up any of the seams. Then we're going to clean off the ends, put a styrene plate, and then use very fine styrene tubing that's going to be glued on. We'll end up using a pin vise to bore the holes a little bit bigger. And then to finish it off, I'm going to drill a hole down the center and use a screw on there to kind of add that little extra detail that it's like the rotary piece in the center. Thankfully, the weapon mounts were already separate, so all I had to do was just lob off the one little peg on the bottom, and they were really simple just to glue on. I'm just revisiting the leg that I had reformed earlier. Now that it's fully cured, I'm going in with some more green stuff, and I'm going to try to match the line work with the existing leg so it blends together as nicely as I can get it. We're going to do the same thing with the weapon arm as well. We're going to throw some around there, sculpt it up, just so it makes it seem like it's a fleshy termination instead of just hovering on the surface of the body. So I ended up using more of the motherboard stilts that we had used earlier on the jaw. And I had some varying sizes of them, so we're going to go from large, medium to small and attach them on the back like they're sort of energy coils or like heat sinks or something like that on the tail. I wanted to add a little bit extra detail to the back of the weapons platform, so what I ended up doing is using a little piece of copper wire, forming to the shape that I want, and then mounting it to the platform. I'm kind of just going over the model now and cleaning up any messy areas, anywhere where there was a little too large holes or some odd line work. I'll be going through the model and fixing up a lot of areas like that. Originally I wanted to sculpt a robotic foot over the existing foot on the mechanical leg, but then I kind of realized That's too big of a project. So what I'm doing is lobbing off the foot. Resolder new lines, feed it through the foot, and then reattach to the existing lines inside. It was a huge headache, but some work later we got it all done. Now that we have the new line fed through the foot and wired up to the original body, we're then going to add a metal rod that's going to be embedded into the existing leg of the T-Rex, and then the other end is going to be mounted into the base. That way it's going to be nice and stable, that any accidental hitting or anything is not going to snap it off the base and make me cry. Using ribbon cable peeled to the right width, I was able to chop up fine rectangular pieces of rectangular styrene tubing, and they perfectly slid right onto the ribbon cable, and it made a really great ammo belt. I'm just going back and revisiting some problem areas and filling in some gaps with green stuff, just giving that final touch. Fans of dinosaurs that are watching this are probably noting the 3 claws instead of the actual 2 that T-Rexes have. But that's fine, that's okay, I like the 3, I'm just going to extend them and make them a little bit sharper looking. It's time to begin the base. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of align the T-Rex so we have our point of reference where it's going to stand. Now I need a way to kind of hold it, so I'm going to add this wooden block that's going to have a hole that the metal rod we inserted earlier can mount into, make it extra sturdy. The early parts of the base are going to be really iterative because I knew what I wanted, but I wasn't sure how I was going to place it just yet. I know that I wanted a river or a channel of glowing waste that was going to run down the middle, and I wanted some sort of pipeline that the 1 foot that we raised earlier was going to rest on. So as you'll see, I'll kind of move the pipe around. I'm just kind of feeling out where I kind of want this, but I have a general idea. As you notice, I've been kind of carving out the inside of the foam. This is where I'm going to be placing a lot of the electronic work. So we're going to have additional LEDs, we're going to have switches, and we're also going to store a battery pack inside. Now that I was happy where the foot was going to be placed on the actual base, I'm just carving out a channel for the wires to run down so they're not pinched, or it doesn't allow the foot to be raised off the platform too much. Now that the parts are glued down, we're going to start sanding the outside to start forming our round shape. Then we're going to hit it up with some drywall compound to kind of clean up a lot of the areas, and that way we have a nice smooth surface to start working on. The whole thing is going to be powered by a single CR2032 battery cell. So now I'm going to start wiring up the main lines to a coin cell holder. With the parallel circuit already wired up, we're going to give ourselves a quick test to be sure everything works. Yup. To adhere the black pipe together, what I end up doing is I cut off a small piece of aluminum tubing that I then glued to the inside. That way, when I epoxy the 2 joints together, there's a connector on the inside that will stop it from easily snapping in 2. Now I'm just getting the plating all sorted out, kind of figuring out where things are going to go, and also trying to keep in mind accessibility for if I need to change the battery, for example. I'm going to be adding a green LED to the inside of the black pipe. What I'm doing here is I'm grinding the surface of the LED flat instead of the dome shaped. That way I can have a wider light dispersal instead of a focused cone shape that would normally happen. I'm going to be using square styrene tubing, and then I'm going to be slicing it in half down the middle. That way I can get some nice L-shaped brackets that run along the insides, and it's a great way to hold all the panels together as well. I wanted to make a metal grate that sat above where the liquid is going to be. So I cut up a small piece of screen mesh, something that you would use for your windows or for your front doors. I'm just going to add a bit more rivet work to the inside of the joints, and then along some of the other flat surfaced areas where panels connect. This part comes from a NASCAR model kit. I believe it's for an exhaust system, but it's now tubing. I've decided to make the front panel here removable, and I'm going to be attaching magnets underneath it as well. But that way I can remove this and I can have easy access to the battery. I originally added mesh to this, but I ended up hating it and removing it. I'm going to need something really strong to hold this pipe down into place, and I don't think super glue is going to cut it. So I'm going to have some 2-part epoxy that I mixed up, and I'm just adding it to the raised areas that are going to make contact with the surface. I didn't like the idea of the pipe just resting on the surface. There was no mechanical connection that held it there, so I ended up using some rectangular styrene box tubing, and I'm making some bracket frames that kind of go around it that made it seem like it was bolted and held down. You know what this project needs? More LEDs. So I'm going to add a third LED to this whole chain. The light is going to be mounted right above the level where I'm going to have the liquid, and it's going to cast a green light going right across the surface, and it will slowly fade towards the end. Should look really cool. Now it's time to seal it all up. Hopefully nothing goes wrong, but we're going to use some epoxy to seal the unit together, and then we'll go in a little bit later and we'll fill in some of the extra gaps. Now that the whole unit is together, I can add in the final piece of the brace. I couldn't do this until now because the one leg of the brace goes right into the riverbed. This was also an iterative process. It took a lot of back and forth, a lot of fine sanding, a lot of filler, just to make sure we have a nice smooth surface on the outside. I'm revisiting the removable panel. I did not like that mesh that I put on it, so I tore that off and I cut out a new piece of styrene that I'm going to use a screwdriver and start making panel lines by just scoring the surface. I don't want to go too deep because I don't want to cut through it. If you don't have a screwdriver nearby, you can also use the back end of a blade. Keep in mind, it will be thinner lines, but I find that a standard head screwdriver does the job just nicely. With that all done, the only thing to do is glue on the magnet. Once I have that all aligned and I know where it's going to go, glue it on, and we have a nice snapping removable panel. Well, that about wraps up this episode. We have our kit bash complete and everything is primed and ready so we can move on to phase 2. In the next episode, we'll be covering the paint job and the final assembly before we can see this beauty in action. So, be sure to stick around, and as usual, I'll see you on the next one.
Hey, thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed this video, we post new ones every other Friday, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out.
You can find us on social media, the links are below, and don't forget to watch our other videos for more Mad Goblin content.